Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining this MTF webinar on migration and Massachusetts. And we're going to get started in just a minute as we allow folks to join. So thank you. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining Massachusetts and migration. And we're about to get started. This is a first in a series, MTF's webinar on migration in Massachusetts. This webinar is part of a series that examines Massachusetts at a time of transition and explores the key challenges and opportunities before the state. My name's Doug Howgate, and I'm the president of the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization. We focus on public policy issues that relate to sustainable and equitable economic growth in our Commonwealth. That work covers a lot of ground, from budget to tax to transportation to education and childcare, and more recently on demographic and labor force trends. And we think the webinar today is a perfect example of our mission and our work in action. It's bringing together experts to discuss an issue of clear relevance for policymakers, employers, and the state as a whole. And it's hopefully making that information and related policy recommendations accessible to a wide audience. There are a few reasons we thought today's webinar would be helpful to ongoing discussions about migration in Massachusetts. First, it's to give more of a nationwide perspective on the issue. What are the larger patterns in the movement of people in the US that affected Massachusetts before the pandemic, and what's changed since the pandemic? And why do these issues matter so much to states, their finances, and their futures? We also want to look at how migration-related challenges and opportunities are affecting different regions and different sectors within Massachusetts. And that's what our panel discussion is for. So we're going to get the program going momentarily, but I wanted to start with a few thank yous. I want to thank our presenter, Asha Birnaka-Levestro, manager for Fiscal 50 at the Pew Charitable Trust, for her presentation today. Thank you, Asha. I want to thank our panelists, who you'll meet in a few minutes: Pam Edinger, president of Bunker Hill Community College; Tricia Canavan, CEO at Tech Foundry; and Luke Schuster, executive director for Boston Indicators. And I want to thank our generous sponsors, without whom this event would not have been possible. So thank you to ML Strategies, thank you to Point 32 Health, and thank you to our lead sponsor, the Massachusetts Competitive Partnership. I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca Davis from MACP in a second, but before I do that, just a few logistical notes. So the first half of the program will be a presentation from Asha, and we'll follow it with a 30-minute panel discussion. There is a Q&A option for attendees. If you type a question into the Q&A, we, the participants, can see it, and we'll either address it in the discussion, or if we type an answer back, all participants can see it. And against all odds, I have remembered to record this webinar, so we're recording as well. So with that in mind, I want to turn it over to our friend and partner, Rebecca Davis. Rebecca is the Chief Operating Officer at the Massachusetts Competitive Partnership, to introduce our presentation. Take it away, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Doug. It's so nice to see everyone. For those of you that are not familiar with the Mass Competitive Partnership, we're a nonprofit where our board is comprised of the 19 CEOs of most of the major employers in Massachusetts, focused on the region's economic competitiveness and vitality. And I just want to say we so value our partnership with the Mass Taxpayers Foundation. We see them really as a critical thought partner in so many of these issues. I'm particularly excited for today's conversation. We hear over and over again from our CEOs that one of the major challenges they're facing in Massachusetts is accessing talent. And I think it's really critical for all of us to understand how these national, regional, and local migration trends are impacting our labor pool. So with that, I'm so excited to introduce our panelists. We have Asha Birnaka-Levestro, who is a manager with Pew's State Fiscal Health Project, where she tracks and explains demographic, economic, and fiscal trends to help policymakers address challenges to their state's long-term fiscal health. Asha has a number of different degrees, including a doctorate in public policy from George Mason University. And I'm so interested to hear what she has to tell us. So turning it over to you, Asha.
Thank you so much. Let me just set up my presentation. Okay. All good, Doug, on your end?
All good.
Okay. So good morning, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me. I am very happy to be here today. My name is Asha Birnaka-Levestro, and I am with the Pew Charitable Trust, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. For those of you who are not familiar with us, Pew does research and advocacy in the public interest, and we focus on a great variety of issues, from the environment to health to state finances. At Pew, I am a manager on the Fiscal 50 team. Fiscal 50 is a hub for data and analysis that shapes states' long-term fiscal outlooks. So what we provide is a zoomed out perspective that encourages state policymakers to think beyond their current budget cycles and really focus on the long view. We provide a multiple key fiscal and demographic indicators. You can see them listed here. And they range from tax revenue collections to rainy day funds to long-term liabilities and many others. I must note that Fiscal 50 is currently undergoing a massive redesign. So please check back in January when we relaunch. We will have even more informative and interactive graphics and articles that go beyond our bread and butter indicators and really get to the core of state fiscal issues. But today, I will focus on our population change indicator. In this indicator, we use the decennial data from the Census Bureau to track how fast or slow state populations grow over the long term. And we also use the annual estimates to track changes from year to year. Now, some of you may be aware that the way that the Census Bureau provides the annual data is as of July of each year. So during my presentation, when I say 2022, for example, what I really mean is the period between July of 2021 and July of 2022, not the calendar year 2022. It's a little technicality, but it is important to keep in mind during today's conversation, especially to understand the patterns post-pandemic. But let's get to it. So if you are here today, you are probably interested in how population change affects your state. You may have seen the somewhat recent headlines cautioning that Massachusetts population is declining and that people are just fleeing to other parts of the country. But watching your state's data in isolation doesn't tell you the whole story. So I'm here today to help you get a deeper understanding of how your state is doing by stacking it up against trends across the US. What I would like to start with is getting us all on the same page in terms of the why. So why should we care that there are more or fewer people in the state? There are, of course, so many reasons why you might be interested in it, but today we will look at population change through the lens of state finances. Population trends matter to state budgets because they are tied to both sides of the ledger and beyond. So let's start with the revenue side. More people in a state usually means that there is more economic activity. So you have people take jobs and buy goods and services. There are more businesses opening up. You have a greater labor force pool, more employers, and a growing tax base. And that all generates more tax revenue for the state. On the spending side, when you have more people, you also have a greater demand for public services. So for example, policymakers in states that currently enjoy an influx of people, they have to figure out how to sustainably accommodate those new residents. So they have to figure out all sorts of things from housing supply and prices to healthcare to public safety, and the list goes on. And all of that can result in spending pressures for those states. Another consideration is covering long-term commitments. So greater population means that you have more people helping cover the cost of promised pensions and promised public retiree healthcare and the cost of public debt. And these obligations may be harder to repay when you have fewer people contributing to the state budget. And finally, let's not forget that population plays a role in how much states receive from some federal funds. And we have hundreds of those funds, but the largest of them, like Medicaid, they use formulas to distribute funding across states. So the size of population, and as is captured by the census, can significantly affect the share of the funds or the size of the reimbursement that each state receives. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the composition of population will also strongly affect state budgets. So, if you think about age distribution, for example, it will definitely affect how much your state spends on education and on healthcare, but it will also affect the labor force pool. But these more detailed aspects are outside of the scope of my presentation today. So now that we have a common understanding of why people are important to state budgets, let's take a look at who is gaining residents and who has a reason to worry. So the bottom line is that we all have a reason to be somewhat concerned. Although population in the US is expanding, the pace of growth has been slowing for decades. Growth over the 10 years prior to the COVID-19 pandemic was the slowest since the Great Depression, and it only got worse since then. In 2021, population growth plummeted, and in 2022, it bounced back, but was still only half the pace of the very sluggish 2010s. But aside from the turbulence ignited by the pandemic, what happens if we extend these long-term trends into the future? Now, I don't have a crystal ball, but I did borrow one from the University of West Virginia. The Weldon Cooper Demographic Center there provides 50 state population projections through 2040 at this time. And what we see in each of these state tiles is 4 bars. So the 2 bars on the left show you growth rates by decade from 2000 to 2020. And that is actual data that really happened, and I will get back to it in a minute. But the 2 bars on your right show you the projections for each state. So it is evident that most states will grow, but the pace of growth is projected to continue slowing. A few states are projected to lose residents, and you have here states like West Virginia, Illinois, and Mississippi, and these states have been losing residents for at least a decade now. But you also have a few more, including some of your neighbors. So we have Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont. They are also projected to lose residents at some point through 2040. But Massachusetts, right here, is projected to grow through 2040. Now, there is a caveat to this data, and I owe you an explanation. So this data is based on the 2010 decennial census, and it will be updated in the coming months to account for the 2020 census. So these results could change somewhat. And another thing is that these projections are based on long-term trends, and they do not account for anything that happened during the pandemic. So, we should keep this in mind that we need to take this graphic with a grain of salt. But the reason why I'm showing it is because these complement the long-term trends that we see, and they indicate that the pace of growth will likely remain moderate at best in most states. And that also confirms the national projections from the Census Bureau that have the same projection for the nation as a whole. But let's shift focus from projections and let's take a look at what actually happened over the recent 10 plus years. So this map is showing us population growth rates over the 2010 to 2020 decade. So we see that the South and West have been gaining residents the fastest, while the Midwest and Northeast were home to the slowest growing states. And this has been the trend for about a half a century now. Still, Massachusetts and your immediate neighbors grew over the decade. Now, some of you may be searching for that specific Massachusetts number, trying to figure out how it fared during the decade, and I can tell you that it actually did pretty well. So Massachusetts, which is marked in orange in the graphic, was ahead of the national trend. A national trend is a 50-state median in green. Massachusetts ranked 21st across all states in population growth over the decade. And among its immediate neighbors, it was the fastest growing state over the decade. And I include here among the neighbors, New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. One more, there you go. So what happened in the recent years? Where are all those scary headlines coming from? Well, the pandemic certainly exacerbated the long-term trends in general. So we do see more of that population growth concentrating in the South, especially. And at the same time, the regions of Northeast and Midwest lost residents in 2021 and in 2022. And that's where we're really starting to see these population declines in Massachusetts and some of your neighbors. In the year through July 2022, 18 states lost residents, and Massachusetts was one of them. When we look at population growth rates across all states, Massachusetts ranked 13th from the bottom. And within the microcosm of your own neighborhood, Massachusetts was one of the 3 states that lost population over the year. Only Rhode Island and New York ranked lower. So here you go. Massachusetts has been following the national trend and growing at a decent pace over the long term before the pandemic. But recently it started to shrink along with nearly a third of the country. So we finally approached the big question, why is it happening? So state populations grow or shrink depending on 2 reasons. The first one is whether there are more births or deaths. And the second one is whether there are more people coming in or moving out of the state. And that includes domestic and international migration. So nationally, we owe the decades-long slowdown in population growth, and I mean here a trend that is even longer than what you see here in this graphic. We owe it to a combination of factors, including slowing birth rates, an aging population, and slowing immigration. So let's unpack it for a minute. The key indicator, the key factor so far was the birth rates. So birth rates have generally been declining since the baby boomer generation. Some of the reasons behind it include a drop-off in birth rates among Hispanic women and among teenagers, and also changing societal norms. So, women are marrying later in life, they're having children later in life, and they're generally having fewer kids. And, like birth rates are higher among married women than not. That's why this is coming up. Economic uncertainty also seems to have played a role, especially following the Great Recession. So what we need to remember is that typically birth rates fall during recessions, but then they bounce back afterwards. But that's not what happened after the Great Recession, because the birth rate never picked up afterwards. And while across the country the birth rates have been consistently declining since the baby boom, the generation that was born during that era has only grown older. These days, the baby boomers are starting to enter their twilight years. And the number of Americans over the age of 85 is projected to double in 2040 to 15 million from 7 million in 2020. Going forward, the mortality rates will likely increase as this really large generation, in fact, it's one of the largest in US history, as they age. And birth rates are likely to stagnate around the current levels as projected by the Congressional Budget Office. So we really are left with immigration as the key player in sustaining population growth in the US. In fact, the CBO estimates that the net migration will account for all population growth beginning in 2042, as you can see in this graphic. Okay, so let's take a look at closer to home. Is it true that basically everyone in Massachusetts is just packing up and heading to sunny Florida? Well, not quite, but there is something to it. I am, of course, oversimplifying here, but out of the 18 states that lost residents in 2022, losses in Massachusetts and 10 others were driven by people moving out. Many of these states, including Massachusetts, recorded more babies than people who died, even with the elevated rates, death rates associated with the pandemic. But this natural increase was simply insufficient to offset the losses from outmigration. As I mentioned before, the pandemic accelerated the long-term trends nationwide, and that was also the case for specific states. Illinois, for example, had been struggling with people leaving for years prior to COVID-19, and the trend only intensified during the pandemic. But new patterns also emerged. So there is this group of states that grew before the pandemic, even if it was at slow or moderate pace. But in 2021, the pandemic stimulated some dramatic shifts in population there. So I'll stick to the Northeast and I'll mention states like New York and Massachusetts, but generally it's states with densely populated urban areas. And they experienced waves of residents moving out during the pandemic. And at the same time, we also saw sudden population jumps in some unusual suspects. And for example, we have this group of New England states, including Connecticut, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. These 4 states grew slowly over the long term before the pandemic. But in the first year of COVID especially, they experienced an influx of newcomers. So presumably, people moved to these less densely populated areas, which were often nearby, to wait out the worst of the pandemic. And I'm saying that because the data that takes us through July of 2022 show us that some of these patterns already slowed down a bit. So New York, for instance, continued losing residents, but at a slower rate than earlier in the pandemic. And growth slowed down in parts of New England where we saw population jumps only a year earlier. But in other cases, the patterns continue. So the rate of population decline in Massachusetts, for example, accelerated in 2022 when compared to the prior year. And that's because the rate of outmigration accelerated. So we can't be sure what will happen next. So will the pandemic patterns revert or will they stick? Will states like Massachusetts or New York return to their pre-pandemic growth rates? One thing that is evident, though, is that movement of people is becoming the leading force behind population trends in many states across the country. It already is in Massachusetts. Now, this is another instance when I'm going to ask you to take a chart with a grain of salt. And that is because the Census Bureau is revising the data prior to 2020. And some of these findings may change a little with the new data. But again, as of today, this is the best that we have. So this chart explores the 2 factors behind population change. So we have net migration, which is the ratio of newcomers to those who leave, and natural increase, which is the difference between births and deaths. We can see here which of these factors contributed more to your state's population growth. The orange portion of the bars indicates that for years, Massachusetts was able to attract more people than it lost to other states. And most often it was the major contributor to your state's population growth. But recently, the lack of newcomers turned population growth to a decline. But recently doesn't start with the pandemic. You can see that even in 2019, people left Massachusetts in greater volumes than previously. It appears that the number of newcomers and those who left canceled each other out in 2019 before the trend actually inverted in 2020. So this makes me think that the pandemic is not the only event to blame for the jump in outmigration. Again, Massachusetts continues to have more births than deaths, which is great because it really isn't the case in every state. But so many people have been leaving your state recently that newcomers and babies are just not cutting it to keep the state's population growing. So since the domestic migration appears to be the hot topic in Massachusetts, let's see where people are going. And to do that, we'll need to mix the data sets here for a minute. So we'll step away from the census data and we'll draw conclusions from data provided by the Internal Revenue Service. This data compares where people file their taxes each year, which allows us to track migrants across states. And we at Pew tracked the data between 2012 and 2021. So before COVID, the top 5 destinations for residents who left Massachusetts were Florida, New Hampshire, New York, California, and Rhode Island. And there really was no major shift in the first year of the pandemic. The same 5 states were the destinations for out-migrants from Massachusetts before the pandemic and in 2021, according to the IRS data. Now, some of this came as no surprise. So Florida has been a very attractive destination recently. In fact, in 2022, it was the fastest growing state in America for the first time since the 1950s. But what caught my attention a little bit here is that two of your neighbors, so New York and Rhode Island, they remained on the list of the top destinations. And the reason why I found it a little bit interesting is because, and you perhaps remember it from my previous slide, both of these states recorded greater rates of population decline in 2022, even than Massachusetts. But like maybe this neighborly population exchange is quite common everywhere. Anyway, the last thing that I would like to touch on before I wrap up is some of the options for states. So we don't really hear governors touting population declines in their states or working really hard to repel residents. In fact, we hear more about states competing for residents and for workers, especially if it's peer states in terms of a leading industry. Some states with declining or slow-growing populations even provide financial and fiscal incentives to attract people to move there. But the truth is that no matter which way the trends and projections point to, states should be preparing for what's to come because shifts in population affect state budgets in multiple ways. One tool that states can use is long-term budget assessments. This tool takes many factors into consideration, including population in many cases, and projects revenue and spending several years into the future. So this way, states can figure out if they face structural budget deficits down the road, or if they are on a fiscally sustainable path. My peer colleagues are finalizing a big report that will discuss states' practices in the area of long-term budget planning and even budget stress testing. So more details are come in November, so just a month from now. All I can share now is that Massachusetts is one of 20 states that have not published a long-term budget assessment or any other type of long-term revenue and spending projections. So this concludes my presentation. I hope that the information I provided was helpful to understand how Massachusetts fits into the national population trends. Please remember that you can visit Fiscal 50 to download, share our graphics at no cost. And if you'd like to be notified about new publications, please feel free to email me, or you can sign up on our website and we'll add you to our distribution list. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'll turn it over to Doug.
Thanks so much, Asha. If you just want to stop sharing your screen, that was phenomenal. So thank you so much. And just a couple of takeaways for me in listening to that. And it's really, I think this is exactly why we wanted to do this, is to get this sense of how we fit into the bigger picture. And so for me, you kind of got three trends, right? We've got an aging nation where we're aging a little more than states. We've got these long-term trends of people moving from the northeast to the south. And then we've got changes in how people move pre and post pandemic, with moving from some kind of urban cores to other places. And while the numbers moved around, and I think Massachusetts did a great job kind of punching above its weight pre-pandemic, kind of over time, that long-term planning you mentioned, those are three factors that probably aren't in our favor, right? When you think about the shift of folks south, an aging population, as well as the fact that we've seen population growth in Maine and Vermont and these places that hasn't historically been the case. So those, to me, are why unpacking this issue, what can we do to mitigate the out migration, and also what does it mean for our long-term future? That's why this is such a critical issue. So thank you for that. One thing I just wanted to clarify, when you talk about some of those migration data and then those numbers, that is both domestic and international migration, right? So when we see that trend line for Massachusetts, it includes both of those factors, correct?
Correct.
Excellent. Yeah. And so one of the things Andy Bagley on our team has done a lot of work on recently is unpacking, disentangling those two things, right? Where historically speaking, I think Massachusetts has been a real magnet for international migration, offsetting domestic migration. So even within that, you've got kind of some factors. And then finally, and then I'll ask our panelists to join, just talk a little bit more as Fiscal 50, I know you folks are going to have a big report coming up, so I won't ask you to preview that. But for a place like Massachusetts, what are some of the things that Pew looks at to help states think about that type of long-term planning, or some of the things that we do or we might want to consider as we think how to plan for what this means in the future?
Sure. So, like I didn't really talk about it during my presentation, but, like one thing that I would really look into deeply is the composition of the population, and both the people who stay, but also maybe even more importantly, the people who leave. So are you losing younger or older people? And if you're losing younger people, maybe you have fewer kids in the state. What does it mean for your state? Like you will, in the short term, it may not be all that bad, right? Because you will have, lower enrollment rates. You won't have to spend as much on education, so it's a win. What happens in 10 years or 20 years when these young people start entering the labor force somewhere else? Is your labor force going to be big enough to keep your economy going? And then another thing that I would highlight, and only because I feel like we don't really talk about it often enough, is really covering the cost of long-term commitments. So, like we have this indicator, it takes into consideration pensions, retiree healthcare, and debt. And, like if you look at debt alone, I believe in 2020, Massachusetts debt as a share of state personal income is third highest in the country. And like debt, we don't really talk that much about debt because it's like not all that high, and states have been very responsible since the Great Recession, and like the trend line has been relatively stable. But the thing to remember is that the debt is not going anywhere. States are legally obligated to pay off this debt before any other obligations. And I don't think anybody's going to care in like 10 or 20 years that you just don't have enough people to pay into your budget and pay off this debt, especially that you also have pensions and retiree healthcare. And you'll have to find this money somewhere. And if it's not there, then you have to pull it from education, healthcare, public safety, or some other area.
Yeah, oh, that's great. Well, again, thank you, Asha, so much.
Sure.
And with that, I'll ask our panelists to turn their camera on, and we'll move over to the panel. So thank you so much. Wow, and wow, officially done. That's great. So great to see everyone. So now we are officially in the panel portion of the discussion, and I want to again just thank everyone who's here. So Pam Edinger from Bunker Hill Community College, Trisha Canavan from Tech Foundry, Luke Schuster from Boston Indicators. Thank you all for joining. And really, the point of this discussion is kind of why does this matter, and what can we do about it? What are we seeing? And so I want to start, I think, building off of Asha's presentation and ask each of you, and maybe Pam, I'll start with you, is kind of when you see this now national perspective and all of these trends and what they may mean, what do you see? How do you see this in your day to day? And what are some of the implications both for you, but for policymakers in general about this from your perspective?
I think the first question that came to mind, because we are a community college, is who are in our communities now? Who are our residents? And connected to that, who's going to make up the future workforce? If the quantitative areas of our population is changing and the key characteristics of our residents are changing, then the effects on workforce training and tailoring the needs of education, post-secondary in my case, will be critical for policy making. So those are the things that are that I think are worth keeping an eye on.
Excellent. Trisha, Luke, any from your perspective and where you sit, how do you see this playing out?
Sure, I'm happy to address that. I live in Western Mass. So I think from the Western Mass perspective, these trends may be even more urgent. We are about 12% of the state's population as it is. And looking at the most recent census data, 3 of the 4 counties in Western Mass lost population, with Hampshire County gaining like a little over 0.2%. And Hampden County, which is where Springfield sits, and Berkshire County, which is where Pittsfield sits, were among the top 5 counties with the largest population loss in Massachusetts. So, these trends are very concerning to us, I think, as a region, and the ways that some of these trends play out day to day. Like many areas in the state and in the nation, we are having some real workforce challenges currently. And when we look at how these trends will play out over time, I think, as Asha mentioned, that's especially concerning the number of young professionals that we're losing to outmigration statewide. I think when you take that to its logical conclusion, again, Asha references, what does this mean in 20 years for the state? And from my perspective, I think that our biggest asset in terms of economic development is our education system and our workforce. And if 50% of that formula is not as strong, how do we stay competitive? And when we talk about having a state that's competitive, I think it's important to recognize that means that there's opportunities for people who live here. It's not just about business being successful. It's about people being able to build really good lives, and for us as a Commonwealth to provide the services that people need to thrive. So definitely some more to do. And I think there's a lot of opportunities to address that. So I hope we get into that later on.
Definitely. And I want to look at your perspective, and to me, that gets to one of the, I think, challenging things about this discussion over the recent months is we need to be clear-eyed about the challenges we face, but also we need to be not just clear-eyed, but kind of enthusiastic about the things we do well, right? Because if we just focus on one and not the other, either way, I think it's a recipe for not success. And so it's making sure we understand that these are real challenges. This is not just kind of a boogeyman, but at the same time, there are some things that Massachusetts and all our regions do particularly well. But let me turn it to you for your just kind of initial reaction to Asha.
Thanks, Doug. Maybe I'll change what I was going to say just to riff on the last point you made, because it really resonates with me. I mean, I think if people in many other regions of the country saw us having this conversation, they might be envious of the position we're in. And I think that is helpful to keep in mind. I mean, what's on my mind really centrally to all of this is housing costs in the region. We've at Boston Indicator been looking at some of the data that Asha was looking at nationally at the regional level, and it just jumps off the page how much housing has to be a central driver of the domestic outmigration we're seeing. And it's a weird dynamic because we're starting to see an acceleration of people moving out of greater Boston. So in a sense, that's demand going down, but it's as housing costs continue to rise dramatically. And to me, there's just a lot going on here, but I can't help but think about how much more prosperous we could be if we fixed our housing problem, if the economy grew more. I mean, our ability to do redistributive investments to build the affordable housing we need are going to be so much greater if we have a growing pie rather than fighting over a fixed pie. And there's such strong economic research on across the nation's history about how inequality has been reduced at a much greater level during periods of an economic boom. Coming out of World War II, when the nation's economy was growing, that was a period of shared prosperity where labor did well too. And I'm worried we're entering a period in greater Boston where the economy could slow down if we don't fix these problems, and the politics of addressing them are going to become all the harder.
That's a great point. And I know your team has done some work on that I want to get to in 1 second. But before we do that, Tricia, I just want to ask you again, because one of the things that I think resonates with a lot of folks anecdotally, but I wonder if this is what you see out in the Springfield region, is this idea that, in 2018, we weren't losing a lot of people to Maine, right? And so you see this kind of fundamental change, not for everyone by any means, but for a large cohort of the population, there are some different factors that are impacting location choices. And you see that is a microcosm in Massachusetts with population growth in the Cape. You talked about a little bit, of the county, some counties gaining population, some losing in the western part of the region. How do you see that playing out in the Springfield and some of those regions? Where are there boom towns out there where people are moving to, I don't know, Lee because it's really nice compared to a place like Springfield or a place, where they may have been closer tied to their work prior to?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there are always those boom towns, right? The places that are really considered hip to live or very affordable or both. It's been interesting to kind of watch that evolution. I grew up here and moved back to Western Mass about 20 years ago, and just sort of watching the evolution of towns that maybe were considered not as desirable, and now suddenly, I think fueled, to Luke's point, fueled by affordability, right? We see towns like East Hampton has really evolved and become a much more desirable destination. So I do think that there are those areas that are considered great places to live, but sadly, it's just not enough to offset some of the other things that we see going on.
And let me transition, Luke, to some of the work that your team is doing, because I do think that, you know, the challenge for policymakers, a challenge for policymakers as well, is what's a blip and what's a trend that's going to continue. But I know you folks have done some digging on some of the Metro Boston location decisions. Are you willing to share a little bit of that? Because I think that could be interesting for folks.
Yeah, happy to. This is a little preview actually of the 2023 housing report card, which we're going to release in early November. So keep an eye out for that. But I'll share my screen quickly, and I'll just show these graphs as a real just teaser.
Yeah.
What these slides look at is some of the exact same migration data that Asha was showing, but it's Greater Boston and trends to and from Greater Boston. So this is just the total population of the region back to 2010, and very consistent with the story that Asha showed, a sort of steady increase to 2020, but then 2 consecutive years of a decline now. There we go. This breaks out those different components of population change. The green line is net international migration. The blue line at the bottom is domestic, and the red is the net migration effect of both of those. And you can see how much at the top international migration is kind of saving our butts here. Net domestic out-migration has been negative for almost a decade now, and it's accelerated in the last 2 years. So that's really disturbing. The next couple slides, and then I'll stop this. Just look at the domestic migration piece of this, and you can see the kind of widening of that gap, folks entering Greater Boston versus people leaving. And then the other thing we wanted to do is just start digging into this data to see if we could see a divergence for some subgroups here. So the first one we looked at was breaking out by income, low, middle, and high income. And it's really all groups over the last 8 years or so, an acceleration for the most part of low, middle, and high income populations on net leaving the region. And then
hey, Luke, just to go back to that for 1 second, I think one thing that resonates with me about this, though, is when you think about the greater location choices that folks may have predicated on their jobs, there's probably some correlation there with people with higher income jobs. And that's at least potentially reflected in this data, where you've got bad news across the board, but maybe more people with high income have the ability to work remotely more, or things like that, which I just think is interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I'll just, since you've highlighted the high income line, a story on the low income line that I think is troubling, and this is not specific to Boston, but there's been growing evidence that in sort of high flying coastal cities like Boston, San Francisco, New York, cities used to be a kind of hub of opportunity for lower income families, for new immigrants. And some of the immigrant story is still there, but we're seeing more and more low income families leaving these high opportunity cities because they just can't make the math work in terms of housing costs. And the last one quickly is breaking out by educational attainment. And again, it's sort of everybody. We've seen an acceleration in net out migration.
Well, that's, first of all, a great teaser for your upcoming report. I think you'll do a great job with that, and fascinating stuff. And if folks want to return to a couple of those points, happy to. But I did, Pam, Tricia, you both talked about workforce. And so let me start with you, Pam, to talk a little bit about kind of the community college perspective here, because to me, that is also a fascinating one. And I think I would start with immigration and first-generation Americans, where I think the theme's pretty clear. If we're going to do well here, it's going to be our continued reliance on new Americans, people who arrived here recently. You folks are front and center for that. Talk a little bit about the importance of the international immigrant community to getting ourselves out of or continuing to see economic growth in Massachusetts.
Right. I was so fascinated by Luke's presentation, because the college serves 4 or 5 gateway cities. And we are seeing the growth of these gateway cities in Chelsea and Revere and Malden and Everett. And yes, most of it is low-income communities that are just emerging. But we're also seeing multiple generations of those immigrants coming in and trying to establish a beachhead, right? So historically, America was built by immigrants. So I think we're seeing a lot of those old patterns repeating in a different way. I am just struck by how much activities are going on in these gateway cities in terms of entrepreneurship, small businesses, the push to come back to train for entry level, particularly areas in health and computer science and life sciences, in order to establish that first step in immigration. One of the things that struck me about the kind of strategy work or policy work that we need to do is to clearly acknowledge that the characteristics, both culturally, linguistically, and the psychological readiness of our populations have changed, right? So if we're going to leverage the immigrant population to backfill this loss of younger populations and high school graduates, we have to approach it differently. And I don't know if we've gotten there yet. A lot of the conversations are still transactional, right? You give me 5 people widgets and we're going to keep those 5 people widgets and grow them to the next level. I think it's different than that. And we have to be much more flexible about who we're receiving into our workplace or into the college, so that the training acknowledges all of the assets that comes with it, the resilience, the grit, all of the things that we talk about, and then change policies and procedures in order to retain. We can't afford to lose these folks who are internationally immigrating into the college or into our community. So that's one thing that I think is going to be a significant cultural change that needs to occur.
I want to return to a couple more higher ed issues, but Tricia, let me ask you. So you, Tech Foundry, you do workforce development in the Springfield region related to IT professionals. And so to me, there's a couple fascinating intersections here, right? One, in that IT jobs are often the most mobile, right? So as we think about where folks may be able to still kind of work in Massachusetts but live somewhere else, that there's a tie there. And then 2, kind of what happens to these folks once they get the degrees? Do they stay? Do they not stay? So talk a little bit about the work that you do and how you see that sector kind of playing into this migration discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'd love to amplify something Pam referenced, if I may, before I answer your question.
Sure.
Ensuring that we are creating systems to receive people, whether it's in our community colleges, in our workforce development programs, or in our hiring companies, to ensure that people can be successful. I think I've been in this role for about 1.5 years, and I'm increasingly struck by how important it is not just to provide the training, but really to provide community, to provide wraparound services. It's impossible to overstate how critical that is and how much we need to do this to ensure that we have the workforce that we need. So thank you, Pam, for those comments, because we see it in spades here for sure. In regards to your question about IT professionals, so Tech Foundry focuses on serving low to moderate income who are underrepresented in tech. And so most of our graduates do stay locally. Although interestingly, a lot of them want remote work, which I think is so interesting. And I actually discourage that, because I feel like for your first job or 2, you really need to be in the workforce. Like, it will benefit them to be with mentors, co-locate with mentors. But most of our students do stay. And I think it's similar to what we see in our community colleges or many of our state institutions, maybe with the exception of UMass Amherst, where students often are local when they go to a community college or a smaller state institution, and typically stay in Massachusetts. So we do not see a lot of out-migration among our graduates. But I do know that certainly when we talk about higher ed broadly, that is a huge concern as we look at the huge numbers of young professionals that are leaving the state. And I think that there are tremendous opportunities there with that population of young people who come to Massachusetts for their education, to retain them. I think there's so much more we could be doing.
And I do think that, as we look at some of the places where you look at the budget this year with Mass Reconnect or in-state tuition for undocumented immigrants and financial aid, you're starting to see, we just did a workforce report on a significant increase in workforce spending in Massachusetts over the last couple of years. And so you clearly see the dollars starting to follow this discussion. But to me, it's fascinating what Pam, both you and Tricia mentioned in terms of get that how do we help these students or these young people? It's not just about getting them enrolled in a course. It's about kind of making sure that long-term success is a part and parcel of the way. And so I think that really resonates in terms of policy. I'm curious, and then I want to talk a little bit about higher ed demographics too, because that's interesting to me as well. But curious for any of the panelists, as we think about some of the models that exist for making sure we are providing those wraparound services, we are doing this well in a way that's also scalable. Any things you would flag for policymakers or folks on the call about, like, we got to do more of this or we got to do less of this?
I actually want to thank the current set of policymakers. They have really been thoughtful. I thought it was significant that when the governor put together her transition teams, rather than having one for higher ed and one for workforce, she mushed them together, right? So she used higher ed policy to support workforce development and economic vibrancy. And I think that kind of cross-sector thinking or cross policy thinking is really what we need. So really health and human services, education, and economic development that comes together. There are a couple of levers that I think it's worth looking at as we think about the vibrancy of the educational sector supporting our employers. One is opportunity costs. And here's a strange example. Every time I take a cab from the college to the airport, I end up doing a higher education come back to college selling jobs. They're almost mostly immigrants and are from our gateway cities working second jobs in order to support their family. And a lot of them have professional background. So the opportunity cost is to allow them not to work that second job, but have the tuition and fees paid for, have wraparound services paid for, so they can actually come back and train. And without that piece, it is really going to be hard for them to support family and yet start a new life. The second piece is that we think a lot about, oh, let's get him a job. Let's get him an entry-level job that pays a decent wage. But some of these folks are in their late 20s, early 30s. They have another 60 years to work. We have to figure that this is an entry to a pathway and that employers and colleges must work to get them into the workforce, but then also pave the path of them to get their bachelor's, get their master's. So we really do fill out the middle, right, of our workforce development plan. So it's a now and later strategy. And to keep track of what major sectors are growing. We know IT is growing, we know healthcare is growing, we know life science is growing, but also to make strategic investment in things like clean energy and AI. And in some ways, business and humanities that supports those industries, right? So that we have, I think it's Asha who said, well, we need to have a budgetary understanding of what it means on the long term. We're planning ideas of getting people back to work, but I don't think the conversations about how do we sustain that with budgetary and strategic alliances in all these sectors has happened. So I think those are the levers that we need to look at as policymakers and then support it with budgetary development.
Trisha, any other thoughts or things that on your list of the to-do or to not do list?
Yes, I have a long list, but I will keep it short. I think, again, I would reiterate a lot of the things that Pam has identified. I think stipends for training and for internships, we struggle to find paid internships for our students, and it is a requirement of graduation. Employers may be willing to host an intern. They may not have the money in their budgets for that. And again, we serve adults. Many of whom have families. So the opportunity cost to them to come to training can be significant. And we have a lot of people who work overnight and then come to class for 5 hours, which, and then go home and take care of their kids, right? So how do we make it more possible to do that? I think that a recent conversation that I had recently is thinking about a hospitalist model. If you have to go into the hospital, many hospitals now have a hospitalist who is in charge of coordinating your treatment and care. And I think we need to take that model for people that are entering the workforce so that there's like this coordination of services for them, and it's long-term, and it's mentoring and coaching long-term, to build those career pathways. And I think particularly in IT, and we love higher education, but you don't need it to succeed in IT. You can get to high 5-figure salaries with certifications. So figuring out what does that coordination look like? You know, I think there's an analogy to a freshman entering high school. You start talking to your guidance counselor, right? Or first year student, I guess we're supposed to say, right? And so your guidance counselor is that coordinating person for you through that 4 years and into the next step in college. So how are we doing that for people that are coming to our community colleges, our workforce development programs, particularly those that are new to this country? I would highlight super briefly one other model that I think is fabulous. Bay State Health, which is the largest employer in our area, has started some pilot programs where they are hiring trainees as full-time employees.
Right.
And they are training them to, you know, have med tech roles, patient care roles. And so these people who are going through the training are not experiencing that economic setback by getting the training. So it's this type of innovative thinking about how do we build our workforce and how do we connect people to opportunity that can lead to long-term living wage jobs and careers.
And to me, the kind of a couple of threads that are coming together is this panel discussion went by faster than I anticipated it would, as is always the case. It is right. I thought when you think of the challenges, to me, two things jumped out from Asha's presentations, jumped out from Luke's slides as well. The demographics are probably not on our side in terms of an aging population, things like that, kind of some of the bones of the eastern states, but we've got a lot of advantages. Concerning when you see that increased decline in higher income folks, because that is a key part of our economy. How do we make sure that we are competitive for those folks to stay here? And at the same time, what you absolutely don't want is higher income folks leaving because they don't want to be here, and lower income folks can't afford to be here either, right? Like that, and that's that 1-2 is a world we really don't want to be in. And then on the constructive side, it's whether it's through public higher ed or workforce programming, rethinking how we use resources, money, time, engagement with public-private actors to make sure we're maximizing these populations. And actually, just a quick pitch for MTF, we've got a report coming out in the next couple of weeks on sector-based workforce investments, that what we do, how we can do those things better. But I want to give each of you a minute. You've talked about some great kind of key concerns or key policies you think we should engage in. And Luke, I'll start with you. But as you think about how you are approaching this issue going forward, and you think about, you've talked about housing, you've talked about a couple of the key concerns, but what would you kind of highlight for a policymaker as they look to take advantage of our strength and address some of these challenges?
Well, since I'm on limited time, I'll just continue being the housing guy on this particular webinar and just say, it's actually an exciting moment. I don't know if folks saw the announcement of Governor Healy's housing bond bill yesterday, which includes not just a bunch of big investment priorities for housing construction, but also some policy proposals that could make it much easier to build affordable multifamily housing. There's a proposal to legalize accessory dwelling units statewide. California has worked on this over the last several years and seen a real significant uptick in those sorts of smaller, modest-sized housing getting built. We're also in the middle of communities having to comply with the MBTA communities upzoning requirement, which is expecting in a new way from the state that every community with rapid transit access build some multifamily housing near their transit assets. So the common theme across all of that in my mind is the state taking a more proactive role in sort of deregulating the housing market. We've had this long-term structural problem of devolving so much of the important land use decisions to 351 really teeny, governance units, the cities and towns in Massachusetts. And we've had this sort of zoning race to the bottom when we've done things that way. And that's a big part of, it's not the only reason, but it's a big part of why we have such high housing costs. So work, to do that statewide, I think is promising, and there's been some momentum we can build on. Great.
Tricia, any kind of closing thoughts from you?
I think that we need to innovate more and move faster. I mean, to Pam's point, there's some great things that are happening from a policy perspective. I'm really excited about this cliff effect pilot that is being launched. I think in terms of, again, young professionals, incentives for them to stay in Massachusetts. And I think regional or statewide internship programs, our employers need it. Our students need it, whether they grew up here and they're coming home for the summer, or they're students who are here studying. There's tremendous opportunity there. So thinking big and aligning our efforts to common goals, I think, are really important.
Great. And Pam, I'll leave you with some final thoughts on that.
Well, thank you. That's a heavy burden. I think we go back to first principle, which is, who are we talking about? Every time we think about scale up in any one of these areas, we tend to get cookie cutter. But there are very specific communities of immigrants and population growth that we're supporting. What allows people to stay, or what sometimes entice people to stay, is really community. The community they form in education, community they form in the workplace, communities that they form around housing. There's reasons why arrival cities or gateway cities exist, because culturally it's accepting, culturally it's belonging. If education and the employer sector can think in that way, that it is really culture and relationships that make people stay in a state as much as anything else, right? And make that the center of some of our policymaking and design deliberations, I think it will help. It's not the whole solution, but certainly there's more of a chance of us leveraging that human element, right, to make policies and strategies and implementations closer to people's heart. And people stay because they have relationships. So
yeah, well, I think that's a great final thought. So thank you so much, Pam, Tricia, Luke. I want to thank Asha for her wonderful presentation earlier. And again, I want to thank all the attendees, and I want to thank our sponsors, ML Strategies, Point 32 Health, Mass Competitive Partnership. Thanks everyone for joining. We're going to do several more of these in the year to come, so stay tuned, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you very much.